one of the founding members of CMMC Launchpad. CMMC Launchpad exists to help organizations across the defense industrial base better understand CMMC requirements, reduce confusion, and take practical steps towards readiness. Our main goal is to provide clear, business-focused information that helps companies make informed decisions as CMMC requirements increasingly appear in DoD solicitations. In our view, this is a critical component as well of national defense. The DIB has, a very important role in helping our country maintain a strong national defense. So just a few quick logistics before we begin our discussion. This session is being recorded and will be made available on demand through the CMMC Launchpad YouTube channel. You can submit questions at any time of this presentation using the Q&A feature, and we'll address as many of those questions as we can through the session if time permits. And we'll also have like an open microphone session at the end where, if you have other questions, we can have a discussion and stuff. And normally those are really helpful. So I would argue, stick to the end because there's a lot of good information that comes out of those sessions. Today's topic is CMMC 2.0 readiness, what defense contractors must do now to stay eligible. So we're pleased to welcome James Reid. He's the practice team lead and vCIO, vCISO at NexusTek. James brings decades of executive cybersecurity leadership and hands-on experience in helping organizations work through CMMC, NIST, SP 800-171, and related regulatory requirements. He brings a practical perspective on what matters now, where companies often get delayed, and how to build a realistic path to readiness. So without further ado, James, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and share my PowerPoint here, and we will jump right in. Can everyone see that okay?
Yes.
Perfect, thank you. And to Joe's point, I mean, he covered what our core topic is today really well, right? CMMC 2.0 readiness, what folks within the DIB, companies within the defense industrial base have to do now to stay contract eligible. And I wanted to start with highlighting that this isn't just a cybersecurity conversation. I think that's a big misnomer with organizations, is whether or not this is truly cybersecurity or whether or not there are other pieces to it. This is about whether or not you can keep and win contracts and whether or not you can bid on those contracts in the future. And I'd be curious, looking at the audience today, you're welcome to use the raise your hand feature. And if not, I'll just pose the question and you can think to yourself. But I'd be curious how many of us here on the phone that are overseeing an organization that needs to be CMMC ready feel like they are ready today. And feel free to use the raise a hand feature if you'd like. You don't necessarily have to, but something to think about, because as I talk with organizations, and I do this essentially every day, I see a lot of organizations, better than 50%, feel like they are far enough along the path that they can get through some sort of assessment or readiness engagement and at least be able to continue to bid. And part of that is because for years you could be on this plan of action and continue to work on DoD contracts. And that's one of the big changes. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. But I would tell you that 75 to 80% of the companies that I engage with that think they're somewhere along that path or close to being done actually fail their readiness engagement with us and end up with work that needs to be done in order to get there. So it's what I want to walk through today, why that happens and what separates companies that pass and can continue to bid and work on those DoD contracts from those that don't. With that, so the reality, right? This is no longer this is now a prerequisite for contract eligibility. It's not just a differentiator. And at one point in time, it was a differentiator. Hey, we're more buttoned up, or we have these things in place. We saw a lot of self-attestations in contracts. This is not a differentiator. It's a requirement. You want to play in the sandbox and be able to do this type of work. You've got to have compliance and meet this framework, meet the 110 controls and the control objectives that boil up into that. It ties directly to contract risk, revenue impact. It's no longer just a best practice. And if the prime that you're working with or the subcontractor that's subbing out work to you requires it, you either meet it or you're out. The real question isn't are we secure? It's can we prove that we're secure? And that's where, some of the work that Joe and his organization have done with evidence gathering and helping to put together mechanisms so that organizations can become compliant but also prove it. That's where the rubber meets the road. We'll talk about that here a little bit more as we get further on. Um, why does this exist, right? Why does CMMC exist in today's world? There's a couple of key reasons. It's shifted from trust to verification. The DoD did an assessment back in around 2019 where they looked at companies who had said they had all of the controls met or the majority of the controls met and found that a very large majority, 70+%, were not meeting what they attested to. And so CUI, right, that controlled unclassified information was still exposed. This is the shift from saying you're compliant to proving you're compliant. And that's the big shift that we're seeing. This is going to affect thousands of contractors, right? Anyone involved and anyone who has folks that they extend work to on their behalf that deals with CUI is going to need to meet this. So I'm going to keep going through slides. Um, why this matters now, again, this is shifted from preparation to enforcement. The law took effect in November, and I've got a timeline that we can talk through, here on the right-hand side. But in November of 24, the rule was finalized. In 25, it came out November of 25, and it started really appearing over the course of 25 in contracts. And by 27, it will be fully implemented and will be mandatory in order to do work in the defense industrial base. So a couple things that are important to note. This is happening now. This is not some future problem. This isn't something that organizations are going to need to be able to meet at some point in the future. I am actively seeing contracts, and I've got clients that have come to me and said, hey, I need to be compliant now because my contracts are being held up with the primes because I don't have this in place. The other thing I think is really worth mentioning is that preparation takes a lot longer than expected. A lot of organizations that I've dealt with, and we just talked about this internally within our organization yesterday, think this is something they can get done in days or weeks. And depending on the complexity and the size of the organization, this can be a months and sometimes even year-long plus effort. There are things that Joe and team and that CMMC Launchpad can bring to bear, and that some of the consulting efforts that we can bring and support that can help you in that journey. But just keep in mind, this is something that takes organizations a lot longer than they think. And I've seen many that have started with a target date in mind and have had to shift that date, multiple times throughout their process of getting ready. Who does this apply to? And before I go through this slide, I do want to mention if you've got questions throughout, please feel free to use the raise your hand. We're happy to address them as we go. Whether I take them or Joe takes them, we want this to be as interactive as possible. If not, we will set aside some time at the end for questions. But that having been said, thinking about who this applies to, right? The big change that's come into play here is what we call flow down requirements. If you are asked to, or if you're doing work for or bidding on a job for a prime contractor or even a subcontractor because you're a small supplier, they are required to put into the contracts the same requirements that they are fulfilling for the DoD. So these requirements flow down. Think about it, and you see that graph on the right-hand side, starting with the DoD down to the primes, right? The big contractors, names that we all know, down to the subs that do work for them, down to the suppliers that they work with for even a part or a technical diagram. If you touch, and then by touch I define in that first bullet, store, process, or transmit CUI, you're in scope. And that's really, I think, the big thing that people need to understand. It doesn't just apply to the primes. It's the entire supply chain. If you touch CUI or support someone that does, this will end up this will end up applying to you. If you're somewhere in that chain, this will end up being your problem to solve. Going back to the earlier slide, just keeping in mind, this is happening now. This is not some future state problem. It's showing up in contracts today. So let's talk a little bit about what it actually requires to be CMMC compliant. This is where I think a lot of companies misunderstand CMMC. I will be clear, tools help. So I'm not saying tools aren't necessary. There are tools, and Joe and team can bring to bear some things that really can assist you in your process. But this is not just about tools or policies. It's about technical controls that are implemented, operated, and provable. And that provable part becomes really important. Being able to have evidence that shows that you're doing that thing. If you go talk with someone who's an assessor, or you go look at the assessment guide for CMMC 2.0, and level 2 in specific is the one I tend to focus on, there's a really clear guide about how they evaluate the controls and proving that you're doing the things that you say you're doing and that the controls require. That's how you get the box checked. If any one of those pieces are missing, right, from implemented, operated, and provable, you won't pass. And so again, defensible evidence, like I've got on the bottom right, the operational maturity, they need to be consistently executed, right? An assessor can say, show me the last 10 people that left the organization, and I want to make sure that their offboarding was completed, right? And you may need to show that during an assessment. So being able to have that provable evidence that the steps are implemented, operated, and that you can provide that at the end during an assessment, that's when you're going to be successful during that period. And it's probably worth pointing out that these assessments aren't cheap. So getting this up front and knowing that you're going to pass that assessment before you engage a certified third-party auditor, and before you spend the time to start that audit, you want to know that you've got all of this in place, because those assessments are not cheap, and it's not something you want to do twice. So the level 2 reality, let's talk about, kind of what this means, right? First off, it's not a one-time project. I've had a lot of different organizations that'll come in, say, hey, I want to be CMMC ready, and then I'm going to move on to my next thing. And the reality of CMMC and some of the capabilities that Joe could help us speak to is that this is ongoing, right? It's not just meeting the control, it's showing operationally the evidence that you can demonstrate consistently over time that you are doing the things that are necessary. Out of those 110 controls, there's roughly 330 objectives that you need to be able to demonstrate. And many of those have very specific evidence and artifacts that you need to be able to have in order to meet that. So consistency across all systems, not partial deployment. Controls need to be actively in place, monitored, and enforced. And when you get to that time of assessment, the key thing that really jumps out to me is if you can't demonstrate it with the evidence, with the artifacts, you won't get credit. I'll talk a little bit about enclaves, but I want to call out because not one size fits all, right? An enclave is a really good way for an organization where either a small subset of the business handles CUI, or it's something where they just need to have a couple of people that interact with a prime or a sub or a contractor. An enclave is a really good approach, and it's one that we see a lot of companies leverage, because not their entire business may not be CUI, and the costs of getting an entire organization to be able to have all those controls in place across the environment can be expensive. What an enclave does is allow you to put that in a box, right? And really from left to right, from the user, right, identifying that user, identifying the endpoints or the assets. They need to be authorized, right? And then we get into access and authentication, right? Identity and access. I talked a little bit about an enclave, and then having some sort of mechanism in place to look at your logging, right? To make sure that all of the different artifacts coming out of your systems, whether that's Active Directory whether you're a Google shop, whatever systems that you're using that authenticate access, could be your wireless logs, just people connecting to your network. How are you collecting those logs? There is a requirement within CMMC 2.0 level 2 to be able to maintain those logs. And I've got that box on the right, the Security Operations Center. This can be handled a number of different ways, so I don't want to oversimplify it, but there is a need to make sure that those logs have some mechanism for monitoring. And that can be, systemic with a tool or a partner. You could have a team that does that, which is a pretty expensive way to do it, but you've got to have access that's controlled, like I say here across the bottom, activity that's logged, and where execution is monitored. And that's going to be across your CUI ecosystem, whether you carve that into a small enclave that sits in a closet or whether that's the entire business. I think this one's worth talking about. This is where I think the rubber meets the road for a lot of companies today. Why organizations think they're ready but fail assessments. And I'll be quick to point out the gaps are not, they're not in the tools, they're in the execution and in the evidence, like we talked about earlier. So most failures, come from incomplete implementation, weak operation, missing evidence, and just thinking about your own environments, thinking about that question I asked way back in the beginning at slide 1, how ready are you? Do you feel like you could demonstrate all of those controls, not just, hey, let's go show that the firewall's set up right, but we want to understand that you've got logging in place and that you've got someone that's looking at those. It's some sort of mechanism for monitoring those. And so if any of these things sound familiar, that would be a red flag that it might be time to look for some help to get you across the finish line. Again, talking about where compliance breaks down, that bottom one is probably the biggest for me, is weak or missing evidence. And evidence or artifacts. Again, if it can't be proven, that's where you're going to run into challenges. We talked about incomplete implementation briefly, where controls are only partially deployed or where they're inconsistently applied, and then just that operational discipline. The stat I've cited there at the bottom is a real stat. Companies that are coming to us for readiness support and help today, we're finding that almost 4 out of 5 are failing their initial readiness assessments. They've got significant work that they need to do in order to get compliant and to show and prove compliance. So how do you get there, right? I think this is a great place to start talking about, right? How do you build the capability, not just compliance, right? How do you implement correctly, operate consistently, and capture evidence continuously? And this goes back to that comment earlier where CMMC 2.0 readiness is not a project. It's not a we got there, we checked the box, we're done. To be level 2 compliant, you have to self-attest every year. So you have to self-assess that you're still continuing to meet the requirements. And then every 3 years, you actually have to go through that full assessment process again as well. So how do you get there? Well, let's talk about that from a practical perspective. You got to implement controls. And if you haven't had a chance to go through and review what the 110 controls consist of, that's a great place to start. I also, for folks that may be watching this and want to take notes, I would strongly recommend looking at not only 800-171, but you can Google 800-171A, which is the assessment guide, because that will tell you for every one of those controls what those assessors are going to look for. That'll help you understand from an evidence perspective, right? They're going to want to see that it's in a policy. They're going to want to see that it's actually being done, and they're going to want to see some sort of an artifact or evidence that shows that has been done consistently. And I guess my follow-on question there at a high level is, if an assessor walked in tomorrow, could you show them what they need? Implementing controls. So implementing controls, this could be a tough one for a lot of organizations because you've got to think about what's in scope. And I won't spend a lot of time talking about scope, but it does tie back to what I mentioned the enclave earlier. An enclave is one way to simplify your scope so that you're not trying to make your whole company compliant with these 110 controls. So I deploying those controls across identity. So that's the people or the service accounts or the systems or the processes, the endpoints, meaning all of the devices in your environment, and the enclave. And again, one size doesn't fit all. You may not have an enclave. It might, if all of your work is for the defense industrial base, you may very well be looking to try and get the entire organization compliant. The next piece is enforcing authentication and access control and enforcing it consistently. Another big thing in an area where I find organizations struggle is baseline configurations and hardening, right? So you go get a new laptop and you issue it to an employee. There are things you have to do to that laptop or to a firewall or to a network switch or to any piece of hardware or something that you introduce into the environment. It may not be hardware, even the software. There's things that you need to do to ensure that it's secure, because out of the box, some of those things introduce risk that's considered unacceptable within the CMMC ecosystem. We talked about logging, so I won't belabor that one, further. But operationalizing this, right? So continually monitoring, reviewing, and enforcing controls. At a minimum, I mentioned that you've got to look at your control set on an annual basis. And that may be someone internally if you're large enough to have a compliance person, but a lot of small and medium businesses don't, and they end up needing to partner with someone to help them with this. And that's one of the areas where, between the CMMC Launchpad and partners, that we can bring to bear solutions and resources to help you there. We need to be looking at regular access, log, and alert reviews. It's one thing to have all those things pointing logs somewhere and to keep those logs. That's important. But if no one's looking at them, then at the end of the day, you're not going to know if a bad actor is in your environment, or even insider threat if someone's doing something they shouldn't be doing. There needs to be very clearly defined ownership and accountability. In the world of CMMC, we talk a lot about, what is role-based access, or how do we define who gets access to what, and you need to be able to have that documented, and to be able to show that it's consistent, right? If you're saying only the engineers that work on these technical diagrams or who have access to our CAD system have access to this folder, you may be asked to show evidence that this is the people that have access to this folder, and here's the list, and here's how often we periodically review it. We talked a little bit about making sure controls are applied consistently, because that's one of the big areas where organizations fail. Proving compliance. Joe, I know can speak to this, extensively, but being able to have the evidence and the artifacts, the logs, the reports, saying, hey, we're reviewing our accounts and access, we're reviewing our control implementation, and we're maintaining all of the required evidence across all of those different controls. And at any point in time, being able to know that you could pull those up and meet those. If you end up, if this is the worst case scenario, but if ever a breach were to occur, and having come in, after a client experienced a breach that was a part of the defense industrial base, you're going to be able to show what was in place at the time, and you'll be audited to that effect or assessed to that effect. So there's a second side to the coin, not just the readiness and the making sure that you're in place so that you can keep, maintain, and continue to bid on new work, but also so that if something does happen, you can demonstrate that you were effectively doing all the things that you needed to do. Evidence needs to be complete, consistent, and repeatable over time, and maybe that should have been my bolded word there at the bottom there, but over time is the key. This is not a one-time thing, and a lot of the evidence that you're gathering, you don't gather once and you're done. You're actually gathering it on a periodic basis, and depending on the control and what that evidence type is, some of those can be frequently, like, every 3 months or even shorter. Some of them could be longer, like once a year, but you've got to be able to maintain that evidence over time. So what does success look like? I think to me, the key phrase is that successful organizations, they're always ready. They're not scrambling. So if looking at and thinking about and talking about the things that we're talking about today, if that gives you any level of angst or helps you to think about things that you might need to go do, that might be an indicator that this is an area that might need some additional focus. Again, a successful program isn't just implemented. We've talked about it ad nauseum. It's operated and enforced and proven over time. And when you can align those three things, that blue box at the bottom, then your compliance with CMMC becomes repeatable, not reactive. And that's what a successful CMMC program looks like. It's repeatable. You're ready at any given time. You're not scrambling to try and be ready for an assessment. You've got everything buttoned up, and you know that if for whatever reason you were subject to an assessment that you weren't planning on, that you've got all the appropriate evidence and artifacts and operational controls in place to respond to that. So, key takeaways. Compliance is an operational discipline, right? Now, it's not something you do once. Um, Mentioned in the second bullet there, controls alone aren't enough. The key phrase that I want you to think about there is that execution and implementation and execution of those controls is what's going to determine success. But at the end of the day, that bottom bullet, right? If you can't demonstrate it, if you can't prove it, which is going back to the earlier slide, why CMMC exists today, if you can't prove it, you're not going to get the credit. Meaning when you go through an assessment, that control will be marked as either not met or partially met. And so, key takeaway, start early, build deliberately, and make compliance with these controls a part of how you operate your business every day, not something that you're trying to check a box and move on to the next thing. And this is going to be the big difference for CMMC and companies within the defense industrial base going forward. So before I jump into questions, I think, again, my key phrase that I would share with any organization today is that CMMC is not an operational shift. Sorry, is an operational shift. It is not a checkbox. And I would follow that on and just ask each of you to think about where are your biggest gaps, or what, if you think you're buttoned up, what might be your biggest gap or gaps today. So I'd love to open it up for questions.
If I could add in a few observations, because you did an excellent job in summarizing the implementation piece. But for those of you on the call, I assume some of you have yet to start the journey. And so CMMC Launchpad is really, it's a set of resources and, places where you can get guidance or meet with experts through webinars. It also operates a advisory service that is a one-time cost where you can get access to someone who has deep experience in helping you kind of understand the scope. And so the first step in the methodology is understand what you need to do, and then that'll help you as you figure out the pricing and strategize how you want to essentially pay for this. So like there are resources out there, financial resources at the state and local level. There's also things like TABA. So TABA phase 2 for SBIRs or whatever could be a way that you could go about at least getting partly compensated back for some of this effort. It is a requirement by contracting officers that you do this. As a result, they're amenable to you applying for TABA funding for this. And then I'd also point out, just so that you don't feel like you're behind the curve, CyberAB publishes a list of the number of companies that are compliant every month or have completed a C3PAO audit for CMMC 2.0 level 2. As of February of this year, I believe it's less than 1,000 companies are basically have completed a C3 PAO audit and have received certification. So that's of the entire DIB, that's less than, 0.3%. So it's still early days, even though, 48 CFR requires that you do it. It's not too late to start, but I think James makes a really great point. It's also, you probably are going to underestimate the level of effort depending on where you're at. It's actually a lot of work, depending on what you need to do. And you may have additional requirements that you also have to factor in. So in the event that, you have to be HIPAA compliant, that should be factored in. Or if you have export controls or you have to worry about, other stuff, it's like you need to understand the full scope of what you need to do. And so our guidance is, that two-step methodology. First, understand the scope so that you can price the whole thing. Make sense? With that, I'm sure you guys have some questions. I know I certainly do if no one else does.